Neuron conduction. The function of a neuron is to receive input information from other neurons, to process that information, then to send information as output to other neurons. This is something we call synapse. They process all of the motor information through which we are able to move, all of the sensory information through which we are able to see, hear, smell, taste, and to touch. And of course, all of the cognitive information through which we are able to reason, think, dream, plan, remember, and to do everything else that we do with our minds. Processing so many kinds of information requires many types of neurons. There may be as many as 10,000 types of them. Processing so much information requires a lot of neurons. Best estimates indicate that there are around 200 billion neurons in the brain alone, and as each of these neurons is connected to between 5,000 and 200,000 other neurons, the number of ways that information flows among neurons in the brain is so large. It is greater than the number of stars in the entire universe. Neuronal signaling. To support the general function of the nervous system, neurons have evolved unique capabilities for intracellular signaling, communication within the cell, and intercellular signaling, communication between cells. To achieve long distance, rapid communication, neurons have evolved special abilities for sending electrical signals, action potentials, along axons. This mechanism, called conduction, is how the cell body of a neuron communicates with its own terminals via the axon. Communication between neurons is achieved at synapses by the process of neurotransmission. Conduction. A membrane potential is a difference in voltage between the inside and outside of a cell's membrane. This difference arises because of ions. Ions are electrically charged particles. The protein membrane of a cell prevents ions from entering or leaving. Resting state. Because the concentration of sodium ions, the red balls, is greater on the outside than the potassium ions, the blue balls, which are greater on the inside. The membrane potential at this state is around minus 70 millivolts. The neurons is said to be polarized. Ion channels are closed. A neuron is stimulated as a result of neurotransmission. The membrane potential becomes slightly more positive, in other words, partially depolarized. In this depolarization reaches the neuron's threshold, a point about 10 millivolts more positive than negative. The neuron will initiate an action potential by completely depolarizing the membrane. Complete depolarization. Sodium channels open and sodium ions rush in. The inside membrane briefly becomes more positive than the outside. This spike is the action potential. The sodium channels then close. Repolarization. The potassium channels open, repelled by positive charge inside. Some of the potassium ions then move through the open potassium channels to the outside. The outward movement of potassium ions begins to return the membrane's potential to normal. The potassium channels closed. Hyperpolarization. Before the membrane potential stabilizes again at about minus 70 millivolts, there is a small undershoot in the membrane potential. During this refractory period, the neuron cannot fire another action potential. Resting state. When the membrane potential returns to its resting state, the excess sodium ions and potassium ions slowly diffuse away from the membrane. The neuron is now ready to fire another action potential.
Created using Powtoon.